Our genetics doesn't change, but our genetic expression does. Genetics only accounts for about 10% of the things that are going on in our system, and 90% is our lifestyle and our habits. Our genes are like a program or a software that's running, and every single choice you make all day long impacts that. It can either turn something on that's favorable, or it can turn something off.
How would you guide someone who feels just overwhelmed in general by toxins?
So an epigenetic diet is going to be one.
Hello and welcome back to the Vibrant Wellness Podcast. I'm Dr. Emmie Brown here with our fantastic co-host Melissa Gentile. Today, we're excited to welcome back Dr. Ashley Beckman. Dr. Beckman is a doctor of Chinese medicine and a board-certified acupuncturist and herbalist in Los Angeles, California. She received her doctorate in healthy aging and longevity and wrote her thesis on epigenetics, the study of how our genes are affected by our diet and lifestyle. She is a certified epigenetic coach and functional medicine practitioner and a contributor to the Huffington Post and Mind Body Green. We're so happy to have her back today to talk about the power of epigenetics for optimal longevity. Please welcome Dr. Ashley. Thank you so much for coming back and talking with us today.
Of course, I love talking about genetics.
Same.
We started talking about epigenetics a little bit in our last conversation, and I was like, we need to have her back. We need to go deep dive into this topic as a whole. So can you start us out by just defining, what does epigenetics actually mean?
Sure. So epigenetics means above the genetic code, right? So these are all the different things that we have a lot of power and influence over our genetics. Our genetics doesn't change, but our genetic expression does. And so that's where epigenetics comes in.
And a lot of us think that our genes are kind of set in stone. We're just, we're born with certain genetics and we're just cursed by our genetics sometimes, and we're going to develop certain diseases because of X, Y, and Z. But your work in epigenetics tells kind of a different story here. So how would you explain the power that we all have to influence our genetic expression? How much control do we really have?
We actually have a lot of control, right? So they say that pretty much that genetics only accounts for about 10% of the things that are going on in our system, and 90% is our lifestyle and our habits. So that 90% is basically where we have this great impact over our genetic expression. So this is everything that you're doing, from the food you eat, your thoughts every day, the type of exercise you're doing, and just your lifestyle in general. And mindset's a big piece too. So there are a lot of things that have been studied that are all showing that we can affect our epigenetic expression every single day. So basically our genes are kind of like a program or a software that's running, and every single choice you make all day long impacts that. It can either turn something on that's favorable, or it can turn something off too. So we're always wanting to optimize favorable expression and then downregulate a gene that might be something that we consider bad, like getting a disease or something like that. But we have so much control, and that's the biggest part that I always want to convey with my clients, because they feel doomed to get something. I mean, how many people have all heard, oh, my dad had heart disease, my mom had breast cancer. And the thing is actually it's our habits that are passed down as well. So that's normally where we keep the cycle keeps continuing, right? It's from our habits, not necessarily the genes.
And exposures. If you think of growing up in a family, we all grow up in the same household, or maybe we live near a cornfield or something where they're spraying glyphosate, and it's we're really just kind of in the same environment. And I'm sure that passing down trauma is probably a piece of this as well. We'll dive into that later. But what would you say to someone who doesn't really believe in the power that they have over their own health yet? How do we encourage patients and even other providers? How do we take our power back?
That's a really good question, because unfortunately, I'd say, in health, there's a lot of scare tactics and fear mongering, right? So I loved epigenetics and genetics And then in every single time or lecture I'm talking about, 90% is lifestyle and 10% is what I'm running on them to see what they might be prone to, right? So a lot of this is how we talk about it. And again, you really want to encourage people to take their power back. I think, a lot of people, they like a diagnosis. They like some of these things sometimes, unfortunately. And it kind of excuses some of their behavior, right? And allows people not to change because they just think, well, I'm just doomed to get this, no problem. So, unfortunately, as practitioners, I think it's a lot of how we message things too, and really encourage that of like giving them power back, because they are the ones that have to make the changes. And these changes aren't always easy, right? Not everybody wants to exercise every day, meditate, have all the clean food and water and things like that. But it's really critical. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't make these big shifts until they've been diagnosed with something, right? So it's up to us to basically, I think, I tell people this is a blueprint of possibilities. But right now, since you're coming to me, you're here to make changes so that this doesn't ever need to happen, right? Like, we're going to do our best to mitigate any of these possibilities, but it's going to take work, right? So not everyone wants to do the work.
And sometimes pain can be a really big influence on like motivation.
Yes.
So to have motivation when you don't yet have a diagnosis can be really hard. And I was going to ask you too, like, how do you go about this conversation with patients that are coming in that do have a diagnosis? Like maybe they do have Hashimoto's or an autoimmune disease or something else of chronic illness.
Sure. So a lot of the things like that, right? So because I'm so heavily invested in looking at toxins and how toxins will turn genes on and off, it's very easy once we run a tox panel to see all of these toxins that are potentially causing issues and being a group of someone's root causes, right? So toxins are a big piece to me. Even in optimization and longevity programs, I like to run toxin panels because those will hinder your ability to optimize, right? You still need to clear those things out even before optimization. So someone, for example, with Hashimoto's, right? Something that I see in almost every single Hashimoto client is mold toxicity. So that is a very big biotoxin or root cause for a lot of autoimmune conditions, right? Again, because I specialize in mold toxicity, of course, I see a lot of it, but most of my clients that are coming to me don't know that they have that. Because it's part of what I run on most clients, I just see patterns, and it is there very often, especially for those clients with mystery diseases, autoimmune issues. And then again, now, sadly, a bunch of these little kids that come for eczema. Again, when you're looking for root causes, we have to look at toxins. And then I love pairing that with looking at genetics, because we can see, could this toxin be more impactful potentially for this client? Like, is this going to be one that is going to be worse for their system? And then again, that can help me determine, is this going to bump up priority of detox for that client? Do they clear pesticides better? Or do they have an issue with mycotoxins or chronic Lyme? It's pretty fascinating what we can look at now with pairing toxins with genetics.
Absolutely. I'm wondering, Dr. Ashley, do we know how mycotoxins can impact expression of our genes?
Sure. So there are some genes that are looked at for chronic inflammatory response. So if someone is exposed to mold, are they going to potentially have a bigger issue with that? And could it create more inflammation or more of an inflammatory cascade than for somebody else? So they found that this is present in about 25 to 30% of the population. So this is the thing though, right? I did not have that gene, but I was the most sick in my home, right? I overall, on my tox panel and looking at my detox genetics, I don't clear a lot of toxins well. So my kind of body burden bucket was already very full when I was exposed to mold. And so I still, again, had the greatest response in my family because overall, I didn't clear things well. And I also was impaired in the glutathione pathway, which is pretty instrumental for clearing out mold if you use that, right? Some people just need more and that helps them. But at the same time, a lot of what you see online, which is incorrect, is people say, oh, I cannot detox mold at all if you have this gene. So again, this is where the epigenetics comes in. You can have the gene, but it doesn't mean that it's been turned on. It's just you need to be maybe a little bit more careful with this type of client because they potentially will have a bigger response. But I just don't want people then to ignore everybody else who has a huge response but doesn't have the gene, and then they're told, well, oh, you should be okay, right? Because they're not.
Mm-hmm. And I want to use this opportunity to switch gears a little bit because we're not talking about MTHFR, but I want to slide it in just for a moment for those listening who think about MTHFR when they hear anything about genetics and epigenetics and nutrition. And you're talking about the gene in regards to mold illness. But if we're talking about maybe the gene in popular knowledge, it's MTHFR. But what you're saying, Dr. Ashley, is it's more about our patterns and the constellation of our other SNPs and maybe genetic inefficiencies that really matter. And so can you speak to maybe the limitations of just looking at MTHFR in that way?
Yes. So it's again, so they call it the dreaded mold gene, right? And I can't tell you how many clients have come to me and said, well, I have MTHFR, right? Like it's this death sentence, right? And again, we know methylation is a whole handful of genes, right? There's a very small percentage of genes that work in isolation. They just don't work that way, right? So even I was talking to a client recently and she was given the info by somebody that she had MTHFR. And I said, well, exactly what do you have so that I can help guide you to the best thing to take to help support that system. But she didn't have any information. And I don't even know what test they ran because she said she never got a test. So, you know what I mean? It's like you really need useful information if you're going to tell your clients that, right? You need to run tests that will show exactly how to help them. And then also, again, it's not like it's just one piece of detoxification, right? And so people get, again, very caught up on a diagnosis or a label. And there are plenty of people, again, that can detox very well. You just give them the proper tools, right? So again, with the MTHFR, I feel like it's a giant scare tactic too, right? A lot of people can base almost like a whole practice on this and getting them. Of course, you need the support, but it's way overblown, in my opinion, because we look at so many things, right? It's not just methylation, right? That doesn't even talk about if someone needs a little more or a little less glutathione, or if you can process, how your neurotransmitters are. Nothing just works in isolation. So it's, I think way overblown.
Yes, that all resonates with me. I hear you. And I think you're alluding to COMT. That's something that I'm surprised I don't hear patients talking about as much. At least I didn't, a while back. Are you hear patients coming in and talking about COMT at all? COMT?
Yeah, well, sometimes, but in regards to matcha, right, in green tea, like if you drink it or not.
I haven't heard those.
Yeah, so again, it's always fascinating to me. I know we have to break things down and make them digestible, but with the genetics, it's not always that easy, right? And then there's so many things that you can do to optimize a lot of genes that's again, I think very important to focus on with clients as opposed to, oh, you have this. And again, even the word mutation, right? They're variants. They are variant from the norm, but the word mutation that was used makes it seem like there's something wrong with you. And there's not really, right? It's just, does your body need extra support in other ways?
These aren't pathologies that we're talking about. That's really important to clarify. Thank you for that. Yes. And that's the realm of functional medicine is there's nuance and we need to understand and think critically about how to optimize and use the right verbiage so that we're not alarming people unnecessarily.
Yeah, stop scaring people, right? Unfortunately, though, that is what motivates so many people. And so then I think, people have different ways that they gravitate with different practitioners. I'm a more gentle, like, we can fix this. Let's give you your power back. not, oh, you've got this and this and this. And I'm still working with people who has, 8 or 10 kinds of mold, multiple types of metals, because we see all these complex cases now, but I don't want them to get stuck in this just, negative thought process that there's something wrong with them. They're not going to get better. It is going to be a long journey, but we have tools and we'll get you through it. Right. These things do clear out. It just takes time.
Yes. Yes. I love the message of hope. I think that's very
Yeah.
appropriate and necessary. And speaking of testing, Dr. Ashley, what types of tests do you like to run to assess epigenetics? Are you looking at methylation testing, telomere length testing? What are you liking right now?
So I do love looking at epigenetics. So I look, did you want me to give the names of companies I use or just in general?
You can, full disclosure. Yeah, we like to be honest.
So I use so again, I still have not found the perfect test, right? Everybody has different algorithms for what they put together if they're looking, let's just say, on a detox panel, right? So it's whomever is creating the panels, they all have their idea of the best genes to include, right?
Well said.
So I've worked with maybe 5 or 6 different companies, and a lot of the times the panels are all different, right? When you're looking at what is pulled together. So I use Self Decode a lot. I use the Vibrant America Detox Panel. I use Nutrition Genome. I used to use Apeiron. And again, I'm looking at a lot of different things. And then there's whole genome sequencing. If someone is really looking at a different perspective and a little bit more medical, if they're very concerned with certain diseases and things like that. I have some very sick clients, and sometimes they just want to look at like a much broader picture. But I specifically am looking at how someone is able to detox these toxins that I have also paired with a total toxin test, right? Because I want to see if potentially this toxic burden is going to be a really big deal for them, right? And for a lot of people it is. And then what is bumped up as kind of what priorities and what order do we put them in? And then the other thing I love to do is I don't do a lot of telomere testing. There are some, and again, I think it changes so much. There's also like the age testing of how basically your like true diagnostics and the true age, but basically you're seeing if you feel like your system is actually younger than what your biological age is. So it's very interesting. I think that's a lot more an optimization. I tend to work with people who they've got a lot going on already, so they're not always in the optimization phase yet. Yeah. But I love working with people that are healthy, that want to get even just optimize their life, their energy, vitality, and everything. So a lot of the times, though, I'm usually pairing with toxin testing. That's the main thing, and then organic acid. And again, those are mostly to see what's going on in your body right now that is hindering or creating some unfavorable genetic expression. And then we pair that with lifestyle to optimize you in all the different ways.
I would like to dive a little bit into the organic acid testing, just because I don't hear that very often used by kind of as like an initial lab workup in like an initial consult by too many providers. So what is it that you're looking? What's that? I know. I remember that from like our first conversation. I was like, oh, I don't, I often hear gut and toxins, but organic acids doesn't usually come up, right away too often. But from the providers that have been on the show that have talked about it, really live and breathe by it, and they love it. I think it can be an intimidating test, is what I've heard. So I would like to know, just with your expertise in this, like, what are you looking for on that test, or what are you seeing?
Yeah, so it's my favorite test, hands down, of like anything. I'd say when I first started my virtual practice from being in a brick and mortar, I would say I built my practice on the organic acid test. So it's such an amazing one because I get the full first, and I forget because the layout keeps changing a tiny bit. So we'll just say there's about 20 markers for fungal and bacteria, and then there's the candida. So you're getting a really great synopsis of what's going on in the gut, right? And within that, there's 4 to 5 mold markers that I look at, right? So if someone cannot do a full mycotoxin test, it gives you an idea, but they are different. So I always suggest both if the person can do that, if we're really looking for mold. And then I love looking at the vitamin deficiencies, right? There's multiple B vitamins, there's vitamin C, and those are really important. There's glutathione markers, so I can see if they're using up a lot of glutathione or if they're low. So if they're using a ton, we can see that their body's kind of going through that, and they're probably needing a lot of detox support. There are the bacterial markers and detox. So if someone has a lot of, I think it's a good marker to see if they're reacting to the endotoxins in the gut that they're exposed to. And then let's see, what are my other favorite parts on there? The mineral absorption, right? So do they have really good mineral absorption, or are they just plowing through the minerals because they're super stressed or they need more? And then neurotransmitters, right? I mean, to me, this test is just amazing, right? So then you can also see, are these gut overgrowths or microbial overgrowths impacting the neurotransmitters?
So you're kind of getting a view of a lot of different body systems in the
Yeah.
same test. Okay,
And
interesting.
I work with a lot of little kids, right? A urine test is so easy, and that test shows them so much, right? If some vitamins are deficient, if they possibly have some OCD or anxiety from neurotransmitters being off, and then why are the neurotransmitters off from all of these overgrowths? And then again, the candida is huge for all the little kiddos that have behavioral issues, eczema, and things like that, to see how much candida they have. And the oxalates. Sorry, I forgot the oxalates. So even though I'm not one, again, this is a whole nother thing for oxalates, we look at, are those all created from the overgrowth in the gut? And usually, because they are byproduct of the candida and bacteria and fungal markers, you can just see, and then I don't have to put them on a severe, very limited diet, because we have to actually take care of the main upstream problem, not the food, right? A lot of times you're just kind of missing the mark if you're just focusing on the food, unless they're just eating, tons of spinach and things and berries and nuts and things like that.
Which is probably not the case with a lot of the kiddos
No.
you see.
And really don't, except, unfortunately, there's some companies, right, in gluten-free foods, a lot of times things get switched over to these almond flour products. And then I see some people really overconsume them, and then we need to, scale it back a bit. But again, it's just very unique and different. Like, we always want to make sure we're looking at the upstream issue and not focusing again on something that's maybe not as critical.
And I think it's helpful to point out also with the organic acids that this is looking at the functional aspect of our physiology and our biochemistry, and then the genetics is just that blueprint. But the items that are really working in action are those organic acids that you're able to evaluate and then modify.
Yes.
So those are kind of modifiable risk factors, right? For XYZ, you explained so many different things just now that it can assess for. And so that's something that you're probably repeating, I imagine, from time to time as needed.
Yeah. And it is one of those labs, again, to me, that just has so much in it. So a lot of times, a lot of these things they're so focused on one thing that it's, sometimes people just have to figure out where's the best place to put their money for labs. And so that one to me is just such a great overall lab. I could go on and on. The test. I love it. And I love teaching practitioners on it too, because again, especially if you're brand new or you're starting out, it's such a great test. It's a good price for clients, and you can run amazing protocols just on that test and make people feel better with their gut health and mind and mood and vitamin deficiencies and detox pathways.
What about measuring nutrient levels? So I'm thinking about B12 and folate, also measuring homocysteine as a function of poor methylation. Are you looking at these to assess these patients also?
I do. I have functional blood panels that I run, and I do include that, and the homocysteine is in there too, and then the B vitamins, and then plus we have the B vitamins in the oat test too. But I love functional blood chemistry, or I try to get, if they're if they can run it with their provider, you know what I mean, then that's great too. But I do look at that and look at some other different markers. It just depends on what's going on with the client. I think a lot of people too, they wait a little bit longer to get functional blood work like that. And then you don't always have like some great baselines from the past, right? So a bunch of people, they go to the doctor and then at 45, they're told, oh, you have high cholesterol or, all these things. And so that's very scary for them and then motivating, and then the same, a lot run into type, but they're in pre-diabetes, right? And so again, they just haven't made health a priority, right? A lot of time, I'm speaking for men mostly too, in their 40s. This is the first time, and they're like, "Oh my gosh, everything's a mess," and so then it's a big wake up call for them, and that's what's great about labs, right? You have things that you think are going on, but when someone can see it, then it's really helpful and motivating for them to make change.
How do
And
we
to track
get our
progress.
guys in earlier? Oh, sorry, Dr. Ashley. What was
No,
that?
no. I was just saying, and then track progress.
Yes, absolutely. That's so important. We want to monitor, and that keeps that incentive going and
Yeah.
that motivation going for people. And speaking of motivation, how do we get our guys in sooner than their 40s when they are starting to feel unwell or they've had that general routine workup and like you said, cholesterol's high and now they're coming to you because they want to dig deeper. Because it is kind of, and we're talking in generalities here,
Yeah.
but it is something I've seen too, is that they our guys don't want to go in until they already have a diagnosis possibly.
I would say, what's actually motivating for them is if they feel like their testosterone is low.
Totally.
Every single guy, they're like, I don't want to take any supplements, but anything for testosterone, sure. So they basically, I think once they start to feel a little bit off, like a lower energy or maybe some weight gain, or like they can't do all the same things and just working out doesn't solve everything for them anymore. That's when I think they start to see a shift. And what's crazy is that's usually mid 40s where women are generally more proactive and often feel more in tune with their system on a regular basis, that when something's off, we go in and often try to figure it out.
It's true. Yeah, generally the women are kind of, we want to investigate, we want to dig, we want to know. We're not afraid of the information. I think sometimes like ignorance is bliss when it comes to a certain a certain group of people, but again, we're generalizing here, but it's true. We've seen these patterns and I think it's really interesting to talk about a little bit.
And I would say though, that's very sad, and I'm sure you see this all the time, is the amount of women that are dismissed. They're looking for answers, and then because they're going to their GP or regular doctor, I mean, they don't even generally run a full thyroid panel, right? And so
it's
the
so
amount of
hard to get.
the clients
It's impossible.
Hashimoto's, they just most of the time I find it because we actually run a full panel because their doctor wouldn't. And that's ridiculous, right? I mean, it's really sad. And that's not even getting to why or how they have it. It's just to get it diagnosed.
We kind of just have different ways of viewing lab testing. Like it's almost like they're trying to keep the testing minimal because they're trying to be really specific in what they're looking at. And they don't want to find extra problems that they then have to go take care of. But we're kind of on the opposite side of like, let's try and look at everything and really find out what's going on so we can address the entire body as a whole and not try to just, give you one supplement for one marker that might be off or et cetera. Just kind of that allopathic approach.
And especially the functional ranges, right? I can't tell you, even as a practitioner, and then this was before I used to order my own blood work, but basically I would go in and I would be 1 point away from, I'll just say, anemia, and they're like, you're good. Where the range goes up to 200, right? And we know you feel sick unless you're or symptomatic unless you're in the kind of upper 80%, which is extremely hard to maintain as a female. But it's very interesting because you'll get this, and then I love it when everyone just says, "Oh, my labs are perfect. That's what my doctor said." I'm like, "No, please send them, and then we will reinterpret them for you for
reinterpret." I love that.
Yeah. So, Dr. Ashley, I do want to get a little bit into kind of your story here. So, You transformed your own health story through detoxification. I know we talked about this a little bit in our first conversation. You didn't really start feeling better until after you opened detox pathways and looked at genetics. Like, it was a whole process for you. So how would you guide someone who feels just overwhelmed in general by toxins in our modern society? Like, how do we start just kind of reclaiming our power over our body, kind of like how we mentioned earlier? Like, how do we stay ahead of detoxification rather than trying to play catch up with a really big toxic load? Because I think we can kind of all agree, no matter how healthy you are, no matter how well you eat, you're going to get still a significant level of exposure. And especially when we put the genetic piece into it, we might even have, different variants that put us at greater risk as well. So what advice would you really give to people to try and stay ahead of the curve here with that?
Sure. So I would say it still really comes down to kind of some basic keys of foundational health, right? I think the amount of toxins and pesticides or food additives and things like that just in regular, like in restaurant food, is so high, right? So if you actually, it's very hard also to just completely avoid processed food. Like, even I think most of us eat better processed food from kind of like from health food stores, but it's still technically processed, right? If it's in a box or something like that. So the more you can actually just cook real food at home, you're going to significantly decrease your toxic load, right? So that's a big thing. The second is looking at, well, again, making sure you have really good clean water, right? A lot of people still use a Brita filter and they feel like they're okay, right?
Mm.
You can look at your water by zip code on the EWG water lookup. You can see certain things that are just high contaminants in your zip code. And again, most of the filters that people are using are not sufficient, right? And then the same, I still am amazed at how many clients still drink tap water because they think that theirs is clean, right? Even I live in something that's it has notorious for having clean water, right? So all the people that have lived in my neighborhood for 30 years, they swear by this water. No way would I drink this water, right? I looked it up. It's not clean at all, but because people just have this idea if you're in the mountains that it's clean. And again, it's just kind of getting data and making sure that it lines up with where we are today. So really clean food you eat, you make at home, even just simple ingredients, right? It doesn't have to be elaborate. But even if you just cook at home with real food, that will help a ton. Making sure you're getting clean water. If you're sweating and moving, every single day, because you need to eliminate as well. And that's really critical. And then the other thing that's also a big passion of mine is what you're putting on your body, right? So your skincare and personal care products are huge. People don't realize that there's so many ingredients that are not banned in our country and that are banned in the EU or in other. I think we're seeing this a bit now with the food too. We're seeing how one country will make a cleaner version of Fruit Loops, right? And they'll use natural flavorings from fruit. And then ours is full of a bunch of different preservatives and toxins that are actually carcinogenic, right? So we'll just forget. And I think they think if something is on a shelf, if it's food or if it is a personal care product, that it's safe. And unfortunately, they're not, right? And so, like, just for example, fragrance can house over, I think it's up to, I think it's at least 200 chemicals just in that one ingredient, right? So
That's the
there's,
worst one. Yeah.
yeah, and
It's
it's
in everything. It's
it
in
isn't everything. And people they just think, oh, it's not that big of a deal. But that's just one thing. Generally, you're putting on over 200 chemicals a day just with the normal routine. Men are a little bit less, but at the same time, unfortunately, people just they forget about this toxic accumulative effect, right? Everyone just thinks like, oh, a little bit's okay, right? But as we know, if you went through your day, the amount of things that we're exposed to is quite a bit. And a bunch of that we don't have control over, right? So any of the things you don't have control over, it is too overwhelming for people, right? So I try to just say, okay, you really can control as much as you can the food you're buying, and just being aware and looking at labels, right? There are still things hidden, but just learn to look at labels or just cook real food, right? Vegetables, meat, if you do okay with grains, and then fruit, right? Just keep it simple. And then again, the other big thing too is just you can minimize the products you use, but there's so many great products out there now. So anything too that you slather all over your body, so the biggest surface area, that's the first place to change. So for some people, that's lotion or body wash. I forget that, you could just, there's so many great soaps that then it doesn't have plastic too, which is a whole other deal. But I love that we can test for these things because I'm sure it's for you guys, but the amount of people, and even on my own labs, I'm like, I don't use plastic. How the heck do I have BPA? And you know what I mean? We do all these things to mitigate as much as we can, and then it's still going to come in, right? Just because of usually lifestyle habits. Picking up food to go for people is a really big one because most of those containers have plastic. And then again, there are just things in there that we would not use at home, right? That is there to make things taste.
And they're putting piping hot food, like scalding
into,
hot
like,
soup in a
styrofoam.
plastic container.
like Thai food or yes,
Yeah.
and it's
Or
like, well, go to
coffee.
a bar. Yeah, we have coffee's a big one. Those
the
cups
cups.
are lined
Yeah.
with BPA. Yeah. And all of these things are out of convenience, right? Like we think that it's better or that it's or again just part of a lifestyle that people lead. But the more we can kind of have simple ingredients, make things at home, it actually lowers your toxic load so much. And so to me, it's just a really big shift.
So if we are, let's say we're a generally healthy person, we're aware of all these things, we're taking a look at toxins, we're taking a look at our water, our food, where are potential sources, and we kind of have done the work in auditing our environment and really taking exposures out of the equation as much as we can. Now, what are some of the things that we can do on the other end of it to be like proactive in supporting detox of anything that's already in our system? Like, do you recommend like to anyone listening that maybe they haven't had lab testing done, but they're like, I just want to support my body's natural detox pathways without knowing my genetics. Like, would you recommend sauna a certain number of times a week, any glutathione supplementation? Like, what are some of those little things that we can leave our listeners with?
Sure. So again, there are a few things. So we'll pop into, there's a diet that helps optimize your genetics, right? So an epigenetic diet is going to be one. It's anti-inflammatory. So you want to make sure you are removing kind of the things that create inflammation for you. So for some people, that's gluten, sugar, for sure. I'd say conventional meat and dairy. You want to have grass-fed meat and then grass-fed dairy, just better, or raw, whatever works for your system, if it works, right? And then increasing a bunch of the vegetables. So sulforaphane is an ingredient that helps with detoxification a lot. So this is broccoli sprouts would be the highest concentration. So it's very easy to add those to, eggs or tacos or whatever you make, take it garnish on something. Cruciferous vegetables, really good. Those also help clear out excess estrogen. They help detoxify the liver, but again, they're higher in sulforaphane, but you would have to have so much of them to have the equivalent of either taking sulforaphane or using the broccoli sprouts, right? So that's really important. Resveratrol, which is in the dark grape skins. So again, this does not mean drink alcohol or wine. It just means take, either eat the grapes or again, it's all the dark berries. Those all have it. And then there is curcumin, which is in turmeric, right? And so that's a really good source for anti-inflammatory support. And then EGCG, which is in green tea. So again, I suggest using matcha because matcha, you're consuming the whole plant leaf. So you're actually consuming it. Where if you have green tea, it's an herbal infusion. And so it's different. Basically, matcha is like eating the green tea, right? And then if you're just making green tea, you're supposed to drink 5 cups a day to get all the benefits that you really need to create epigenetic changes. So Those are some of the basics and most studied compounds in an epigenetic diet. And then, yes, I'm a big fan of, liver support of some kind. I love Schisandra. It's a Chinese herb, big fan of that. But again, you can use different things. I do love binders. So I use fulvic and humic binders, or you can use the Takasumi charcoal, like a really good charcoal. And then I love cell membrane support. I use oil, PC, phosphatidylcholine. I use that a lot because you want to nourish the cell. And then I'm a big fan of minerals and electrolytes. So using those, checking to see what you might be low on, but you don't really need to check on that. If you're asking about ones that like we're not checking on labs, I rotate between different electrolytes and minerals so that you're just getting different compounds. And then the other one that I would say that's also very important though is using, like I use ox bile or TUDCA. The gallbladder is the overflow for the liver. So often when the liver is very congested from too many different toxins, the gallbladder tries to take over. And this is your client that doesn't do very well with digesting fats or meat and things like that. So you need to make sure that the bile flow is happening properly. And again, this is also something that's used a lot for mold toxicity and things like that, is the bile really helps bind up some of these toxins and things. So we want to make sure that's flowing nicely. And again, some of these diets that have high fat, while it's really good for the brain, sometimes the gallbladder can't take it. So if you get nauseous because you've been eating keto or having a lot of good fats, just ideally you would up your ox bile or TUDCA and things like that. Optimize the gallbladder a little more.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, I'm one of those people. I get nauseous if I'm doing like a more keto. Like if I'm doing a lot of coconut yogurts, like just something that's really high saturated fat, I don't do well. I get nauseous. It's interesting.
Yes. So
Nice.
this was maybe 20 years ago. It was when coconut oil, well, it started to get popular. And so I'm an extreme on my own when I test things. I was like, let's put 4 tablespoons of coconut oil in my smoothie. I got so sick because again, when it's a sign if you get nauseous from fats like coconut, especially because it is high saturated fat, your liver actually needs a lot more support, right? So, I mean, the gallbladder does too, but the liver is actually the upstream issue. So a lot of these diets, again, they're really great for your brain, but you always have to modify them, right? Like anytime I've done a keto diet, at least for myself, or carnivore, I had to dial back the fat a lot. Otherwise, it's not good. And then I see in my genetics that I don't process saturated fats that well also. So it's very interesting. I love pairing it up, right? We see this a lot for the Alzheimer's genes, right? And so I'm always checking because all the diets that are supposed to be good for Alzheimer's have so much fat, but there are certain people that should not have saturated fat, right? So it's not so easy. And unfortunately, people just read a book and they're like, oh, coconut oil for everything, right? This is going to help prevent Alzheimer's. But you really need, ideally, to work with someone to get these nuances down, because otherwise then you could be potentially making it worse by using all that saturated fat when that's actually not the best for your particular system.
Yeah, especially right now, I feel like people are really pushing higher fat diets, especially with the carnivore diet, like being so popular, and blood sugar regulation being a massive thing as well. People adding a lot of fats to all their meals. And I'm like, why do I feel so awful? I'm like, I feel good on like a lower fat meal or more moderate fat meal. So just to kind of backtrack real quick, just so make sure I'm digesting this properly. You said epigenetic, or I know. You said epigenetic diet. Is this a certain test that you're testing genes on how we break down food, or where is this coming from?
Basically just all of the nutritional compounds that have been studied the most for epigenetic changes. So where a lot of the research is done is for cancer, right? So when I wrote my thesis, I was searching for which nutritional compounds have the most studies on them that impact actually just disease. And pretty much most of the research at that time, this was a little while ago now, but it was pretty much all based on cancer. So a lot of these things we're trying to actually cancer, cardiovascular disease, right? And just metabolic health too. And then obesity is in there. So there was a ton of research on calorie restriction for obesity, right? So generally people need about 20% less calories. And I'm not into calories per se, but overall people are eating way too much. But they showed that, and this was very consistent in the research, that if you have about a 20% reduction in calories, it on average added about 5 years to people's lifespan. So in general, we're eating too much. Like I think people know that. But again, they weren't looking at the quality of the food. Because again, I don't think calories are a great marker. It's like what are you eating? Someone eating meat and vegetables is a very different diet than pasta and cheese and a bunch of refined stuff. So that was very important. But the biggest research that I saw, again, were which of all these nutritional compounds that are looked at have the biggest impact on reducing someone's susceptibility to cancer. And so that is what I focused on in my thesis. And those were those main compounds. They've added a few more since then. They also do look at soy. I excluded soy because there's so many issues with soy, and because in the States, like 90% of it's all genetically modified. So to me, it's not a health food. And then again, it just has some other potential issues with because it's estrogenic and things like that. So,
And
but
going into that a little bit, did mTOR kind of come up in your research and your work around this as well? Because I know that's something I know we're really pushing high protein diets big time in the media right now. And that concerns me. I'm like, well, are we going to upregulate mTOR a lot and, see proliferation?
So it didn't. I'm trying to remember actually when I wrote my thesis. It was at least 6 years ago. So no, the push this is kind of like pre-carnivore, right? So
Yeah.
and I guess keto was probably pretty high in that time because I was doing keto at the time. And so again, I think it's all about modification and then to the individual. And I understand that's difficult, right? Because most people get their advice from a book, right? They're not able to always work with a practitioner one-on-one. But the ideal situation would be to be able to run a small handful of these labs so that you can actually get something customized. Because that's the thing. I mean, as a practitioner, when you see people and then they're on this crazy high fat diet, but then they have the genes for Alzheimer's, it's like it doesn't match up because they shouldn't be having all that saturated fat. Like they can have other types of fat, but not the one that's bad for that specific gene that they have. So again, I'm all about customization in a perfect world because we really then can fine tune things so much better. And the same, I mean, any women doing keto need to modify it, right? If you have thyroid issues, adrenal issues, have to modify it. Same with all this longevity. Things need to be shifted and changed and adjusted for women. And then it's very different even in our phases of life of if you've had kids, haven't had kids, premenopause, all these different areas. And most of all of this is written for a male system that is much different constitutionally.
Yeah, we're kind of taking all this bio-individuality out of the equation here, just in kind of like the mass media. I just see everyone's kind of jumping on each bandwagon or whatever trends going on and seeing how it affects their body instead of taking into consideration their health history, their environment, their toxic burden, their genetics, everything, how they even feel. Like some people don't even tune in and check into how they feel after eating certain things. And when not, it's wild.
Because they'll see like, oh, I need to cold plunge every day in order to get inflammation down. And it's like, well, are you, no, probably not, or this is in Chinese medicine. That's one thing I love about Chinese medicine is you have all these modalities that people are using now, like sauna, heat, lymphatic drainage. They've been present in TCM the whole time in varying ways, but you adjust to the constitution of that person, right? So you prescribe things based on how that client presents and their current symptoms, and that can shift throughout their life. But some people just should never really be doing things that are so stressful on their body.
Circling back to how some people can't handle saturated fats, just like some people can't handle cold plunge. I'm curious, beyond the clinical presentation of nausea, postprandial to a high fatty meal, is there anything that you're seeing maybe on lipid panels or genetically that help distinguish those individuals who can't handle saturated fats? Because, I'm curious, my boyfriend, he's got a beautifully high optimal HDL. LDL is also elevated. Blood sugar's amazing. His A1C is like 4.9, and it's like, and I'm reading out different phenotypes of these lipid panels based on possibly genetics wherein the individual can't handle saturated fats, but they're probably not predisposed to cardiovascular disease the same way that we think about people with diabetes. Any thoughts on that? I know there's a lot there.
Yeah. So again, and one thing I'd say that's very interesting for me is, so because I'm so into this, I have genetics on my mom, my dad, myself, my ex-husband, my daughter, right? And then a lot of us, I've run toxin panels and other tests as well. So it's kind of cool to see like what comes down the pipeline versus what doesn't, right? For between my parents to me and then me to my daughter. So it's very interesting because at least in this very small snapshot, right? But I've lived this very, I would say very healthy life, but I did have a lot of toxic overload, which impacted and created a lot of symptoms. Yet, let's say, for example, then I had a whole bunch of cardiovascular in my genetics, and I thought, oh, this won't even impact me because I've just done all these things to mitigate that. But then when I ran my panels lately, and again, because I really hadn't run cholesterol ever, because I was like, that's not going to be a problem, and then, or a lipid panel, just because of the way I ate. And there were things that could use a lot of improvement. And it was very interesting because it was from some genetics too. And so, and some of them, like the lipoprotein A, it is often a marker, but it is passed down. And then I checked to see who had it. And it's very interesting too, because there's a lot we can do. And then even though you do certain things, it's like we still have to fine tune like really well. And especially for cholesterol, a lot of the ideas that we've had don't really, or, people don't realize how much sugar impacts your cholesterol. They just think of fat, right? But then again, this is where we fine tune. Like I don't eat coconut and saturated fat in the same way. And then seeing how those little shifts can make a change. And that's one thing I do love though, is when you pair genetics and you just see, but then with actual blood work, the cholesterol and those things, like we can shift, and the blood sugar, we can shift in a month or two, right? It just depends on what you're doing and then how your system reacts, and then getting on the right supplements too, because a lot of these things are they're just impacted in so many ways. And then also people forget how much all of these things are impacted by stress. Stress just throws, it's like gasoline on a fire. And sometimes people don't really know the fire is even burning, but it is just so impactful. And so everybody wishes there was a magic pill, right? Even just for cholesterol or blood sugar regulation, which those are kind of much easier than these like big things that we're talking about, like mold and Lyme. Those are very complex cases. Yeah. But still, the majority of the population is really dealing with metabolic issues, right? And you have to get that foundation in place. If your blood sugar is all over the place every single day and then multiple hours in the day, it's very hard to do anything else, right? Like your body that's the most important thing it's trying to focus on. So again, kind of like that, it's basically, there's so much fine tuning. And again, we wish it could just come down to some supplements. Everyone thinks like, oh, it's just a supplement plan. It's like, no, it's mindset, movement, meditation. You know what I mean? The supplements are a piece, but the lifestyle, the food, all the thoughts you think, do you actually think that you're going to get those diseases that you've been told are in your family? If you do, you have to work on that and say that that doesn't need to be me. Right? So there's just so much to health. These labs are amazing. And again, they're these blueprints, right? The blueprint is the genetics. And then the current labs of the toxins or the functional blood is what's happening now. And then we can track that and then just see if what the things are that we're doing are really helpful, and then just how to keep fine tuning so that we can get back to really optimal health.
Super dynamic. And even what you just said, Dr. Ashley, it's the meditation and the exercise and our thoughts, and that changes every day. One day I might want to do HIIT, and the next day it's, maybe I just want to go for a really gentle walk. So even our needs change day to day, which is something we've talked about before. And I think that's so important to really honor and make sure listeners understand that it's all of this is dynamic and it changes, and we'll see that in the labs, and it's a journey for sure.
And learning to listen to your body, right? Like your body is giving you clues. So even though people don't like the symptoms, even when they're very sick and they're wondering, what did I do wrong or what's wrong with me? It's a sign that something is off, but it's a clue to help you, right? Like your body is telling you something. And so the more we can listen and then we are able to take action on that, I think the better it is. And so becoming really aware of your system and then again, seeing what it needs is really critical, because that's what you're doing every day, all day as the client, right? The doctor can only help you so much, but you really are the one, or the client is the one that is taking charge every day with your thoughts, your actions, what you're doing, exercise. And again, it's giving you your power back, and then just listening to your system to see what your body's telling you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it can be a challenging mindset shift, because I think clients and patients and, even myself, growing up seeing conventional medical doctors, it's like we put all our power in them. And it's like they're supposed to be the one that heals us, and they're supposed to just give us the protocol. And it's not really us healing our own selves. We kind of are so reliant on, their knowledge and their plan. And we weren't really taught how to like check in with ourselves and like, how are we feeling? How do we make adjustments to our own day to day? Do I need more sleep this week because work's really crazy, and, all that stuff. So I love everything that you're practicing here, Dr. Ashley. And this whole episode is filled with so many good things. I need to go back and re-listen. I actually just ordered recently an organic acids panel myself. I haven't gotten it back yet, but I've heard a few practitioners really praise it. So I was like, I need to go find this one for myself. So we'll definitely be circling back. But thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show today. And I know we've had you on before, but if any of our listeners want to connect with you or haven't heard our first episode, where can we find you online?
Sure. So I'm on Instagram, Dr. Ashley Beckman, and then my website's drashley.com.
And we'll be sure to link those down below for you guys so you can find Dr. Ashley online. And we'll also link down below our link to our first episode with Dr. Ashley, where we dove into detoxification and more of her stories. So you can learn all about her there. And until next time, wishing us all vibrant health and wellness.
Thank you so much for being here today. Don't forget to leave us a review and subscribe so we can continue to pay it forward together. And remember, the key to longevity is knowledge. Keep learning, growing, and tuning in to the Vibrant Wellness podcast to discover the latest insights and strategies for optimal health. Join us again next week. Just a reminder, this podcast is for educational and informational purposes and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The views expressed by guest and host are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy of Vibrant Wellness. As always, consult your healthcare provider before applying any recommendations that you heard here today.